PERF, réagit, Re-Act. La troisième édition de la biennale de performance du Centre d'artistes Aix-Néo-7 est présentée du 22 septembre au 23 octobre en collaboration avec le centre de production DAïMÅN, Fait Maison, la compagnie Katie Ward et le Beeldend Danstheater aux Pays-Bas. PERF mise sur la notion de rencontre, inhérente aux pratiques performatives, et présente tous les mercredis du mois les propositions d'artistes, d'autrices, auteurs, de commissaires, de chercheuses-chercheurs, de théoriciennes-théoriciens, de travailleuses et travailleurs culturels et d'organismes réunis dans le cadre d'une manifestation pluridisciplinaire d'art-action. En amont de la biennale, la présente série de Balado, en collaboration avec Fait Maison et une douzaine d'invités, sera diffusée sur les ondes de Radio Hall les mercredis 1er, 8 et 15 septembre. PERF est réalisé grâce au soutien financier du Conseil des arts et des lettres du Québec, du Conseil des arts du Canada et de la ville de Gatineau.
Welcome! This is one of 5 discussions created for PERF and a collaboration between Aix-Néo-7 and Fait Maison. Before we get started, I would like to thank Jean-Michel Quérion, Éric Trottier et Aix-Néo-7, Radio Hull, and my collaborator Thomas Grandin, and all of our guests for being here today. All of these discussions take place in both English and French. For those of you who don't know, Fait Maison was initiated by Thomas Grandin in his home in Gatineau, Quebec in August 2005. Fait Maison was a party, a laboratory, and a performance space to which an audience was invited a few times a year.
Au fil du temps, Fait Maison a accueilli une variété d'artistes de performance établis et de la relève, ainsi que des artistes locaux, nationaux et internationaux, et a présenté ces événements dans divers lieux alternatifs, incluant des maisons privées, une exposition à la Galerie 101 et plus récemment à l'Imagier à Aylmer en 2017. Fait Maison a été l'hôte de plus de 36 événements, incluant plus de 100 artistes et plus de 200 performances. Ce balado s'inscrit dans un projet plus large auquel Anaki Mazia et moi travaillons afin de trouver un moyen approprié de se souvenir, archiver et contextualiser ces performances, événements, artistes, publics et organisateurs d'une manière à la fois collaborative et productive. Pour ceux qui ne le savent pas, Fait Maison a été initié par Thomas Grandin dans sa maison de Gatineau, au Québec, en août 2005. Fait Maison était une fête, un laboratoire et un espace de performance auquel un public était invité quelques fois par année.
Today we have the privilege of speaking to David Kong, performance artist based in Vancouver, about performance, reperformance, and intersectionality. Make sure to catch his performance on Wednesday, September 29th at Aix-Néo-7.
Welcome, David. It's nice to have you with us today for this conversation.
David, you also reperformed Kubota's vagina painting, appropriately called Vag Anal Painting after Shikiko Kubota, in 2005 at Gwent Gallery. You talk about it not only as a homage, but as a tongue-in-cheek response to gendered and racialized representations and readings of bodies in contemporary culture. Can you maybe describe the performance and speak about how race and gender intersects in your performance a little more?
First of all, thank you for the invitation. And before I begin, I would like to first acknowledge the land that I'm on and working on. And I'm speaking to you today as an immigrant person of color, and as well as an uninvited settler on traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Coast Salish peoples, the Musqueam, Snohomish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. In terms of performance, I think there are 2 things that I wanted to speak about in response to your question. First of all, I want to start by framing it as my skepticism over rhetoric of purity. And that includes the idea of pure live performance and pure experience. I don't believe that artistic intention is ever translated fully to an audience reception as wished by the artist. And that speaks to me about one, questions of authenticity versus the copy. And I've explored that through a number of pieces. But I want to collapse that onto a different axis of understanding what authentic is. And if in an art historical context we talk about authentic versus a copy, I also want to juxtapose onto that the authentic versus the cynical or the calculating in terms of, and I think you know where I'm going with this the art star career trajectory of how do I situate my art with regards to the canon to be noticed. And I think I want to push the equation towards the side of the authentic vis-a-vis the cynical and calculating. And secondly, I want to talk about the intersectionality in reading of the body. And when I say body, it's not my individual body, but what my body as a sculptural element in performance represents, as well as the body that I originally come from, that Asia as a body. So I think those things are important, and which is why I want to, throughout our conversation, instead of referring to Namjoon Pak and Shigeko Kubota, I would like to address them as Pak Namjoon and Kubota Shigeko, the order in which those names are articulated in their respective countries. Just as much as we want to be respectful of Francophone and Anglophone dynamics, as well as other languages that are spoken on Turtle Island. So in terms of the intersectionality issue, I want to bring in also the fluidity of this kind of intersectionality, that, you know, if the framing devices are race and gender, it's complicated by somebody who I was reading at the time when I did that performance with, as then known as Judith Halberstam, now known as Jack Halberstam. And in 2000, she published Female Masculinities, and in which she talks about her own masculinity as somebody who identified as butch. And she also conjoins, or kind of is in conversation with othered masculinities. So for instance, the hypersexualized Black male and the hyposexualized Asian male. Around at the same time, there was an ad that I saw in a magazine, Detail magazine, that had an Asian male model, and the caption read, "Gay or Asian," which is an interesting juxtaposition, right? It's an interesting move. It could create a subtlety, but it could also be collapsing the two categories to mean that Asia can only be gay. That is Asian body and Asia as a body, whether gay or straight, or whether trans or cis, right? So it's an interesting cultural gesture that the advertisers chose, and what that intent is, I don't know, but the reception is very interesting that way. So when I reperformed Kubota's piece, and if Kubota was challenging the masculinist works at her time of Jackson Pollock, Yves Klein, Pak Namjoon, who was her life partner. So if they were all like doing these heady works that were also very, very gestural and suggestive of seminal ejaculation of Pollock or Yves Klein, then if Kubota counterposed that with the female body's productivity in a proto-feminist gesture of attaching a brush to her vagina, then for me to reperform it, I wanted to counterpose it in two ways. One was the force of East Asian calligraphy, that is many of the practitioners still to this day believe that to do calligraphy well, you need to have male virility, that the brush is an extension, a phallic symbol, and that the proper subject, the normative subject of calligraphy is the male body. So by attaching the brush to my anus, my intention was to kind of, in a tongue-in-cheek, literally and symbolically, pollute it, right? And secondly, I also wanted to interrogate the white gaze of me as on the stage, and how the Asian body is read. And as I said, Asia as an entire body is read in a feminine way. So one of the disappointing things about post-performance conversations were that some of the artists that I expected them to have a more nuanced reading of the piece immediately jumped to the conclusion that I was gay. Now, whether I'm gay or not is completely a separate matter, right? And we don't even have to go there. But the fact that it went from point A to Z without exploring all the spaces in between that are the interesting meat part of it. And that was disappointing. And so thirdly, and lastly, I wanted to be able to say, of course, we can talk about race and gender, and we often do, but something that gets left out is the issue of class, of course. And that's something that I think that is often left out of the art discussion. So I would like to add that to the conversation.
Thank you. Thomas, did you have something to add there?
The class thing is very interesting because I have a discussion with friends who are not in the art, and for them, having an argument in Quebec, discussion about class being the only matter, that race and sex is not an issue. So it's funny that suddenly it's the other, I tend to present it as maybe sex and race is part of the class system. So do you think it's possible to merge them into in the same discussion in a way? Yeah.
I would say we must talk about them together, but the danger is the merging and collapsing into, and also the prioritization of one over the others. So if we look at the feminist movement and the suffragist movement in the US, feminist movement became a white feminist movement, leaving out the colored women. And so from which came the whole notion of intersectionality by Crenshaw.
Absolutely.
Who's a legal scholar who teaches at UCLA. So, and before that, there was a Combahee River Collective that practiced intersectionality even before. So, to credit to Crenshaw, Kimberly Crenshaw, she doesn't own that term, nor she never says that this is a term that I invented. She is merely describing a lived experience. So, and you know, to further Thomas's thoughts, you know, I just recently read a Guardian article about the union movement, the Amazon labor disputes. And so what the Guardian article finds through data is that if union movements in the past, in terms of the class struggle, was predominantly white in the past, now it is Black and brown and women. And those are the members that represent unions, and and less so white. So there's an interesting class divide that happens that is also collapses onto race and gender divides. So I think that's a good example of where things are shifting, and our perceptions of those movements need to shift along with. Otherwise, I think we're thinking through this an emerging phenomenon through old lenses.
That's an interesting way of putting it. I think intersectionality has become the sort of the word that describes this moment the best, perhaps, because I think people are really taking into account not only class and race, but I mean, not only race and gender, but also class needs to be part of it. And I think that's interesting, Thomas, like you said, in Quebec, class becomes more of an issue than perhaps gender issues. And I think about Britain, I'm half British. And so I think about in Britain and unions and how class has always been part of the structure of Britain rather than perhaps race and gender. I mean, not that it wasn't there before, but just that that was a focus. So I think that intersectionality is an interesting way to frame it. But I'm curious as to how you then see this performance intersecting with class.
It does not.
Okay.
Clearly. And this is where I think limitations of practices or projects, I think, merge with other projects. So it partially, not fully, but partially explains my movement from practicing and teaching art to practicing art and law, soon to be, because I felt like there was some kind of a glass ceiling and wall to talking about and performing class. I think it's practiced by few in a really effective way. You know, Tanya Bruguera, I think, is a classic example of somebody who does that really well, exceptionally, and authentically. But I was interested in some kind of a way to understand and explore and affect change systemically that combined artistic practices and some kind of a legal practice rooted in the law that is foundational and pivotal in some way. And then there's an interesting lecture that I was a part of at the law school. A woman who came in, she was a lawyer who was working with prisoners, women prisoners, and often POC women, lots of indigenous women who are overrepresented in our carceral system. And she ended off her lecture by saying that, you know, I've been advocating for, you know, women in prison for 20 years now. And it seems as though to her that the effect that she's had as a legal advocate pales in comparison to what Orange is the New Black did. So there's something to be said about the effect and affect of art. And then there are also limits to it. So I'm interested in those kind of disciplinary intersections as well.
I think that you use the word merging, and I think that's a really nice word, to not think of these as discrete political spheres or aesthetic spheres or you know, class, race, gender, but to look at the ways in which they merge. And so I think that's also an interesting way. It just struck me that it's an interesting way to think about reperformance as a merging rather than a distinct thing. And so it's actually a way of merging ideas rather than it being a distinct, different, isolated sphere.
And the necessity of reperformance because our context and framing are always shifting, right? So in 1970, La Belle Province became Je me souviens, right? And way of understanding cultural dynamics in the national sphere changed, I think.
Absolutely. And we talk about how meaning is not static too, that is constantly shifting and changing. And I like this idea that you brought up earlier of, you know, intentionality and what the audience receives and what the artist his intent is not fully rendered, you know, the artist's intent can never be fully rendered. And I think that comes up a lot in talking about performance studies and performances and kind of the experience of experiencing performances that we'll get to in a final question. I did have a question about fiction. I'm really interested in the ideas of fiction and performance and sort of where fictionality happens, particularly around performances that never happened as described, and perhaps they never do happen as described, or perhaps they do. And I think, we have texts and we have videos and we have documentation. But I wondered if you might talk a little bit about the fictions associated with your work and this reperformance.
I think it goes back to the kind of the axes that I spoke about earlier in response to your question about authenticity versus calculating. So you mentioned, certain performances do not happen, or sometimes happen but are embellished or exaggerated. And Chris Burden is an example of that.
Absolutely. You see the image and you presume that the bullet somehow went through him when really it wasn't supposed to hit him, and it was just this graze on his arm that was not circulated as much as the image of him standing against the wall.
Or the crucifixion piece that
Mm-hmm.
I had always imagined it when I saw that image in the textbook, that Volkswagen was driving through the streets of LA, or Irvine in this case, which is my alma mater, where he did his undergrad. But the story that I've heard from people who are close to that story have said that he was crucified in a garage. The Volkswagen was pushed out, documented on the streets, and then pushed back in. So it reminds me of, I'm not going to name and shame, but a former student who's now a well-known artist in the US. He performed a piece at UBC. And the reason why I bring it out is not to shame, but to have this kind of important conversation, to discern the difference between what is exaggerated or what is truly documented. It was a beautiful idea of rolling 2 rolls of sod, grass sod, from his studio at the art school down to the Musqueam Territory Reserve. So it would be almost like Aladdin's carpet, where he's unfurling one, hopping onto the other one, and then re-rolling the other, and then so he's always on land, right? On stolen land. And then I was doing a studio visit, and he said, the video that he showed me said it's a 24-hour performance. I said, wow, that's got to be, you must have been exhausted. And then he confided in me that he had done it over 3 days, 8 hours each, because it was too tiring and painful. And I must say my reaction to that was very livid, that it wasn't a authentic documentation and representation of the actual work. So I want us to be able to have those honest, critical conversations in public, which doesn't often happen, or it gets erased through memes. And so I think that's in that spirit, I want to be able to bring it into authentic fiction, which isn't necessarily historical correctness. So the example that I think of is in 2010, when I performed a piece in Montreal called A Measure of War, Je me souviens. I rode a bicycle-powered tank through the streets of Montreal on October 16th. Right? And Montrealers knew what the reference was exactly. There was laughter at the event, and there was some gravitas as well at the site of a military presence in a diminutive form of a bicycle-powered tank. The interesting fiction of that framing, I think, for me, was that in 1970, I wasn't even in Canada. I was a little boy growing up in South Korea. And what does it mean for me as a transplanted POC settler talking about je me souviens. What is it that I remember? And so the timeline is wonky, and yet I want to stake a claim to the remembrance because of a national identity that is always challenged. And I think for a deliberative democracy to exist, it needs to be constantly challenged in that way. So that's where I think fiction is important. Yeah.
But I also think that that's connected to kind of the performity of identity too, and the ways in which we perform identity, and depending on context, we might perform our own identities in different ways. So I think that fiction is a big part of how we perform, particularly in this day and age where we all have like social media as a way, as a performance, if you will. Okay, I think we should move on to the general questions. As interesting as this is, I feel like just in terms of timing, we need to move on to the general questions, if that's okay. So the first question is from Jean-Michel, and he asks, in a few words, how would you describe reperformance or reenactment? In French, they use the word reenactment more than we do in English. So in a few words, how would you describe that, either of those?
Okay. I think about, first of all, maybe answering the question in the negative. Why not reperform? And sometimes, I think, again, referring back to the rhetoric of purity, some people, and I think I've said that, when I say some people, I don't want to designate as some straw man and knock them down, but I think I've said in the past that I don't want to reperform things the way they were for inauthentic reasons. But I do think about one thing that I heard Guillermo Gomez Peña say in a performance. And it kind of stuck with me because it was I embraced it as a critique of my own practice as well at times. He said, performing artists are afraid of innovation or improvisation, and performance artists are fearful of repetition. So I think there's an interesting way in which we can kind of inch towards the other, cross over to see what that is. And I think those are the spaces where new receptions and feelings can kind of percolate. And I want to go back to like the framing question of the importance of reperforming, and it reminded me of attending the PSI Alan Capro happenings in, I can't remember which year it was, at NYU, and there was an African-American scholar who was not an artist, but was studying history, Black history in the US, and I can't remember her name, but I'm sure she'll forgive me. And she spoke about emancipation as a happening. And she said, emancipation was a happening if you believe that Black slaves were actually freed in 1863. But emancipation never happened, or never was a happening, if we understand the vagrancy laws that took effect immediately after Emancipation Proclamation, which allowed the police to gather the newly freed slaves who didn't have any work to go to, and then put them in chain gangs so that they could work for free. Like it's an absurdly cruel historical, but it's also designed and calculated, right? So if we were to think about reperforming, I want to be able to take those submerged histories and allow them to live again in this Black Lives Matter context. So I think that's why reperformance is crucial, without repeating the same old.
Thank you. My next question is about liveness. So obviously what makes performance is the question of liveness, which then brings into question the archive, the event, documentation, which we've talked about a little bit, performance remains, Both Amelia Jones and Philip Auslander have argued for the performativity of performance documentation, that the event takes place in the documentation. And Amelia Jones argues that it's never fully present even when you're witnessing the event. So on some level, I think they're both trying to account for their inability to witness the event as performed. But I wondered if you could discuss your relationship with documentation, the documentation that you used for your reperformance, and also your relationship with your own documentation.
I think your question gets to the heart of the matter of not emergence, but mergence. Is there a term called mergence?
We'll make it a term. It's a good term.
When to parallel that, when Marshall McLuhan says medium is the message, those are, he had taken two traditionally separate categories and merged them into one. And I want to suggest that there's a category, multiple categories in between those two seemingly static categories. So, one piece that I spoke to you about earlier, Anna, is a piece that I did at the Western Front in 2005, I believe, where the quote-unquote same performance was being experienced by the audience members, A, as a live performance, B, as a live feed of the performance where the live performance wasn't seen, and third, a pre-recorded video of a similar setting. So the most astute observers were able to freely meander through the three and be able to experience the mediation of the event, whatever that event is. And there were at least three, perhaps if not more. Maybe the fourth category is a breaking of the proscenium, and however that audience member receives either the partial or the entirety of the piece in his or her or their own way. And for me, that's the most interesting, in the proverbial in-between space. We talk about in-between space and it becomes very static, I think, as is the term intersectionality. We banter without necessarily considering all the historical layering. So in that sense, I'm less interested in the conversation between live versus archive, but live versus mediation, and what our hyper-mediated world, how we experience it.
And for your own work, how do you sort of view the way that media is involved in your work? So I think that's a really interesting project where you have live, and then you have a live feed, and then you have pre-recorded, because it asks you to ask really specific questions about the relationship between liveness and recordings and what you are viewing. But in terms of your own projects, can you talk a little bit more of how you approach your own use of documentation? And the reason I ask this is because in this day and age where everything is over documented and everybody has their phones out and is documenting everything, control, if you will, is kind of given up, right? Because people are there watching, they're taking photographs, they're posted here, there, and everywhere. So we don't have those iconic images like of Chris Burden on his beetle being crucified. We have multiple versions of these multiple that are circulated in different ways. So I wondered if you could maybe address that.
I want to be able to respond by saying that I think it's a myth to say that we ever had control. And that we only have, I think, intention and savviness of understanding what the communication medium is. And even then, I think once we allow the intention to be expressed, then the audience reception in a truly postmodern world is unpredictable how it is received. And yet, at the same time, I often, as a rhetorical device, will say some readings are wrong. So, when when an audience member comes up to me after a performance and says, "Oh, your use of the beef tongue in slick motor oil to paint markings on the floor is totally Jackson Pollock," and I would say, well, I may not say today that is totally wrong, but I would say it is so impartial in reading that it does injustice to our conversation. I don't really care what it does to my own work, but I care greatly about the conversations that we have, I think, which is why I make those gestures in the first place.
Right, so that you want people to respond, not appropriately, but to respond in a way that furthers a conversation rather than returning to an already had conversation in that sense?
Yeah, because when we continue to have conversations that we've already had, then not only does it make it less and less interesting as thinkers, but it also commodifies it that much easier.
Absolutely, like the iconic image. Thank you.
I'd just like to add a little thing. The difference you make between mediation and archive, I think, is solving a little bit the debate we had earlier between us about being uncomfortable with documentation. And I felt that in some ways we were open to archive because you go back to tons of things, you take the time to look through it. But we had a lot of trouble with mediation, how it's put on out, how it's lying in some ways, how it's incomplete. And what you brought to this conversation is really interesting about how do you bring the complexity of the issues out instead of trying to bring them back to a single notion, simplified notion. Is very interesting.
Yeah, I agree. And if I may add, I also want to problematize archives. The assumption is that archives are complete and full. But as I recently found out, all of the performances that I've done at the Western Front do not exist on their archive, which is supposed to be complete. A huge chunk of the archive at Sanare that involved my performances and the curation of Makiko Hara, or Hara Makiko, is gone.
But I think that is the biggest myth about archives. It's as much about what's not there and what can be archived and stored and whose voices are archived and stored and what are we using for knowledge making and knowledge creating, that I think that is the biggest myth about archives. That in fact, it's as much about what the archive doesn't contain as what is in there as well. David, this has been a very interesting conversation. I feel like you have touched on so many important elements for reperformance, archives, mediation, and intersectionality. Hopefully, we'll get a chance to talk more in the near future. Thank you for spending time with us here today. Again, please check out David's performance at Axe-Neo-Set on Wednesday, September 29th.
Thank you, David. I look forward to see your performance at Axe-Neo-Set.